The notice was 3 lines. She had read longer epitaphs. Man seeks capable woman. Widows considered. Ranch work expected. Granger County, Montana. Write to Box 14, Delvin Post. She read it on a Wednesday sitting at the edge of her sister's kitchen table, the kind of table that made clear you were a guest at it. She had been in her sister's house 6 weeks by then, long enough to know the sound her brother-in-law made when he came home and found her still there. Not a cruel sound, worse than cruel. Patient. Her own situation was not complicated to explain, but it took a long time to live through. Her mother had died in February. The house had gone to debts nobody talked about until they couldn't be avoided. She had come to her sister's with a satchel and a sewing box and the understanding that this was temporary. 6 weeks had not made it feel more temporary. She read the notice again. Capable. She was capable. She was 31 years old and she had kept a household very little for the better part of a decade, and she knew how to work without being told what to do next, which in her experience was the more valuable skill of the two. She wrote back the same afternoon. The reply came 11 days later. 2 sentences. The 9th will suit. I'll meet the northbound at Delvin Station. The handwriting was upright and did not lean on anything. She noted that. The 9th was a Thursday. She told her sister on Tuesday, which gave them 2 days to say the things sisters say when they have run out of easier things to say. Her sister cried once, briefly, and then made biscuits, which was her way of managing feeling. She ate 3 of them and put 2 more in her coat pocket for the train. Granger County was a day and a half north and west. She watched the country change through the window. The flat corn country gave way to something bigger and less certain. Hills that were not mountains but wanted to be. Sky that went on past where you expected it to stop. By the time the train pulled into Delvin, the light had gone the pale gray of old pewter, and the platform was mostly empty. She stepped down with her satchel and her sewing box and stood. The platform held 4 people, none of whom were moving toward her. A woman in a dark coat talking to a station master. 2 men loading freight at the far end. A boy sitting on a crate, eating something out of a paper bag, watching the train the way boys watch things they intend to remember. She looked for a man who was looking for someone and found nobody fitting that description. She sat on the platform bench and put her sewing box on her knees and waited. The freight men finished and left. The woman in the dark coat went inside. The boy finished eating and disappeared around the side of the building. The 20-minute mark, she opened her sewing box and took out a length of hem she had been meaning to finish. She worked slowly. The cold came off the mountains in long, low pushes. The platform light flickered once and steadied. At 35 minutes, she put the mending away and picked up her satchel and walked to the station master's window and asked where she might find the ranch belonging to the man whose name was in the letter. The station master's expression did a small, careful thing she had seen before. The particular recalibration of a person who has just understood that a situation is more complicated than it looked. He told her the ranch was 8 miles out on the county road heading northwest. He told her the man who owned it had come through 2 days ago picking up a water pump and had looked, in the station master's words, like a man who had not slept in some time. He said it without judgment, simply as information that might be useful. She asked about a livery. There was one, half a block south. The man there was named Cyrus, and he was direct about price and did not ask her business, which she appreciated. She paid him from the envelope she kept in the inner pocket of her satchel, and he hitched a bay mare without ceremony and helped her load her trunk without being asked, which she also appreciated. She drove north out of town as the last of the light left the sky. The road was unpaved and rough, and the mare had opinions about her pace that required some negotiation. On both sides, the land ran wide and spare, the grass gray-brown and pressed flat by the season. The hills in the distance dark shapes against a darker sky. It was the kind of landscape that did not offer much and did not apologize for it. 8 miles gave her time. She did not spend it on what she would say. She spent it on what she could see. The condition of the fencing along the road, the way the soil banked at the ditch edges, the shape of the hills, and which directions they would funnel wind and weather. She was reading the land the way she read anything she thought she might need to know for a long time. The gate came up before she expected it. A wooden post gate, one hinge repaired with wire and the wire done well, which told her something. The name on the post was painted in plain letters, no flourish. She pushed the gate and drove through. The house was low and set back from a yard that was wider than it needed to be, which usually meant there had once been other buildings and they were gone now. The house itself was unpainted, the boards weathered silver gray. A porch ran across the front, level and solid-looking, which she noted because porches were often the first thing to go on a struggling place. This one had been maintained. She noted that, too, behind the house a barn, larger than the house and newer, the lumber not yet fully weathered, a paddock to the west, a chicken coop to the east that had been recently re-roofed with tin, the metal bright against the older wood. She could see from the gate that the garden plot along the south wall had been turned this fall and left ready for spring. The house was dark except for one window. She stopped the mare at the post and sat for a moment. She was 8 miles from town, it was full dark, and the man who was supposed to meet her train had not come. She took a breath and climbed down. She was tying the reins when the front door opened. He stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind him, which meant she got the shape of him before she got the face. Tall, with the kind of build that came from years of work rather than size. He was looking at the wagon, then at her, then at the trunk in the wagon bed. He said, "You came anyway." She said she had not known of a reason not to. He came down the porch steps and across the yard. Up close, he was older than she had pictured from the letter, mid-40s or a hard 40, with a face that had once been straightforward and now had more weather in it. He was not unkempt. He had made some effort. She noticed the effort. He looked at the trunk. She took one end. He looked at her for a moment and then took the other, and they carried it up the porch steps and through the door without dropping it or discussing it. Inside, a main room with a table and 3 chairs, a cast iron stove against the north wall, 2 windows with flour sack curtains that had been hemmed unevenly but hemmed, a shelf holding a clock, a lamp, and a tin of tobacco. A wool rug on the floor, worn but clean. The floor itself swept. He set his end of the trunk down and straightened. He said the room she would have was through the door on the left. He said the stove drew well. He said the well was 40 feet deep and had never gone dry in 7 years, not even in the summer of 2 years ago when everything else in the county had. He said the last thing about the well in the way a man says something he has prepared to say, and she understood that he had thought about what this place had going for it, and had decided to lead with the true things rather than dress up the doubtful ones. She said the well sounded good. He said he was sorry about the train. He said it without elaboration, which she respected more than an explanation would have been. She said it was all right. He went out to stable the mare. She moved through the left door into the room that would be hers. A cot, a small dresser, a window that faced east toward a line of cottonwoods she could see as dark shapes in the moonlight. She put her satchel on the dresser and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the room. It was enough. She had lived in less. She heard him come back in, heard the sound of the stove being fed, heard water. She sat for another minute and then went out to the kitchen. He was at the stove. He had put water on. He looked at her and she looked at the shelf above the counter and read what was there. A half sack of flour, a tin of lard, dried beans in a jar, salt, a small crock she couldn't identify from across the room. She crossed and lifted the lid. Cornmeal. She said she could make something if he hadn't eaten. He said he hadn't. She made corn cakes and fried salt pork and put his plate at the end of the table and sat across from him with her own. They ate. Outside, the wind moved against the north wall in long, even passes. The clock on the shelf ticked. They did not speak for most of the meal, but it was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were both too tired for the conversation they were going to have eventually and were tacitly agreeing to wait. When she was done, she carried her plate to the basin. He said, "The cattle are in the lower pasture, 23 head. I've got a contract with the Delvin Freight Depot to supply beef through March. The chickens are a separate thing. I started them 2 seasons ago, and they've done better than the cattle some months." He said it plainly, looking at his coffee rather than at her, because he was answering the question she hadn't asked yet. The question of how the place worked, what it ran on, whether it was going anywhere. She said that sounded like a reasonable operation. He said it had been until the north fence blew out in September, and he lost 6 head before he found the gap. He said he had spent most of the fall making up what that cost him, and had gotten mostly there, but not all the way. She listened. She did not say anything encouraging or discouraging. She was taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything, noting the reality of it, not adjusting it to be easier than it was. She said she would want to see the chickens in the morning. He nodded. He poured a second cup of coffee and did not offer her one, not from rudeness but from the look of a man who had been living alone long enough that certain habits of consideration had gone dormant. She got her own cup from the shelf and poured from the pot and sat back down. He looked at her cup and then at her. She looked back. He said, "I had a wife 8 years ago. She left in the spring, took our daughter who was 4. I don't know where they are now. I'm not telling you that as a complaint. I'm telling you so you don't hear it from someone in town and wonder why I didn't say." She sat. She sat with that a moment. Then she said she had not come with expectations about what a person's history had to look like. He looked at the window. He said, "I wrote that notice because I needed someone who could work. I want to be plain about what I meant by it." She said she had understood what he meant. He said he thought she probably had. They finished their coffee. He washed his own cup, which she noted. He said good night and went through the far door. She washed her cup and put it back on the shelf and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dark yard, the pale shapes of the outbuildings, the barn with its newer roof. She thought about the fence he'd lost 6 head through. She thought about the chickens doing better than the cattle some months. She thought about a man who had been living alone for 8 years in a house with 3 chairs. She went to bed and slept without difficulty. She was up before light. She found the coffee things on the shelf, made the pot, and had it ready by the time she heard him come in from the morning chores. He stopped when he saw the coffee and poured a cup without saying anything, which she was beginning to understand was his version of thank you. She said she wanted to see the chickens before breakfast. He took her around the east side of the house to the coop. It was tighter than it had looked from the road. The re-roofed tin had been done right. The edges turned down properly, so water would run off rather than under. 14 birds, clean water, clean straw, the feed bin dry and tightly lidded. 2 of the birds were off by themselves near the far wall and held their wings slightly out, which was a sign she recognized. She checked each one, moving slowly, letting them adjust to her. The 2 outliers were thin across the breast, not starving, just wrong somewhere. He stood at the coop door watching. She came back out and told him the 2 birds on the far wall had a deficiency of some kind, possibly calcium, possibly something else. She asked if there were oyster shells in the feed. He said he didn't know there were supposed to be. She said she could fix the feed mix. She said the coop itself was well kept, which she meant, and he received it without expression, which she was beginning to understand was not coldness but economy. She asked about the garden plot along the south wall. He said he had turned it in October after the first frost. He said his wife had kept it. He said the 2 years since he had tried to keep it himself and failed both times. He did not explain further. He did not need to. She looked at the plot. The soil had good color and the turn had been deep and thorough. The problem was not the soil. She said she would put in onions along the south edge in March, which would put some nitrogen back before anything else went in. She said she thought the soil wanted compost and that a pen full of chickens was a reasonable source of it. He looked at the chicken coop and then at the garden plot and then at her as if she had connected 2 things he had been looking at separately for 2 years. She turned and walked back toward the house. They ate breakfast. He told her about the north fence, where the gap had been and how he had repaired it. He described the repair while she listened, and when he was done, she asked one question about the corner post, and the way he answered told her the repair had been good work, done right. She cleared the plates. He went out to the cattle. She spent the morning in the house. She went through the kitchen stores systematically, the way she always did in a new place, not with alarm, but with the particular attention of someone who had learned that knowing exactly where you stood was always better than estimating. The flour was 2/3 full and sound. The lard was low. The beans were plenty. The salt was fine. There was no sugar, no baking powder, no vinegar. She made a list on the back of a flour sack paper she found in the woodbox drawer. She found the account ledger on the shelf above the kitchen table, a narrow book with a cracked spine. She did not open it. She marked where it was and left it. At noon, he came in and she had soup from the beans and dried onions she'd found in the cold box outside, and cornbread. He ate. She said she would need to go into town this week, that she had a list of kitchen stores. He said he went in on Fridays. She said Friday was fine. He said the account at Renix General was current but narrow. He said it in the same way he had said everything, flat and without apology. She understood that he was not asking her to manage her expectations. He was giving her the true information and trusting her to use it correctly. She said she would see what was essential and what could wait. He nodded and went back out. She finished the soup and washed the pot and stood at the south kitchen window and looked at the garden plot. The cottonwood trees at the east edge of the property had lost their leaves, but the trunks were good, the root systems established, which meant the water table in that direction was reliable. She looked at the chicken coop. She looked at the barn roof, solid and new. She looked at the paddock fence, which needed one post reset but was otherwise sound. She went out in the afternoon and walked the property on her own. She walked the fence line along the south pasture and found 2 posts that needed setting and 1 section of wire that had been patched with a second wire twisted around the break, which would hold another season if the winter wasn't severe. She walked along the creek that ran along the eastern boundary and found the watercress her mother used to put in soup and found 2 good stands of late-season rowships higher up on the bank. She picked the rowships into her coat pocket. She walked to the north fence, which was where he had lost the 6 head. The corner post he had replaced was set well, the concrete poured properly around the base and tamped. She tested the wire tension. It was good. He had done the repair thoroughly, which cost him time when he probably didn't have it, but it was right now. She walked back. The light was going the way it did in October at this latitude, abruptly, without much transition. The hills to the west went dark fast, and the temperature dropped a degree every few minutes once the sun was behind them. He was in the barn when she passed it. She could hear him working, the particular sound of hay being moved, and then a lower sound, him talking quietly to one of the animals. Not to himself, to the animal. She had known men who did that and men who didn't. She had her own feelings about which type told you more. She made supper. He came in and washed and sat, and she put the plate in front of him and then noticed the rowships she had left on the counter. She put water on for tea and let them steep while they ate. When she set the cup beside his plate, he looked at it without recognition. She told him it was rowship. She said there were 2 good stands on the east bank and that she would dry the rest for winter. He looked at the cup and then picked it up and tried it. He said he didn't know those grew on the property. She said most people didn't know what grew on their own land until someone looked. He held the cup and looked at her across the table. Not with any particular expression, just looked at her the way a man looks at something he is still in the process of figuring out. After supper, she mended a tear in the kitchen curtain while he worked on something at the table, a length of harness leather he was punching new holes in. The clock ticked, the fire settled. Outside, the wind came off the hills in long pulls. At some point, he said without looking up, "The woman who had this place before, my wife, she didn't leave because of the place, she left because of me." She did not look up from the curtain. She said she had not been wondering about that. He said, "Maybe not, but I've been thinking about whether to say it since you got here, and I'd rather say it and be done with it." She set the curtain down and looked at him. He was still looking at the harness. He was a man who found it easier to say difficult things to something he was working on, and she did not hold that against him. She said, "I came here to work. That's what I said in the letter, and I meant it. Anything else is a question we don't have to answer yet." He looked up then. He held her eyes for a moment. He said, "That's fair." He went back to the harness, and she went back to the curtain, and the fire burned down another inch, and neither of them said anything further, and that was all right too. Friday, she went to town with him on the wagon. The road in daylight was different from the road at night. She could see the land properly, the way the hills folded down into the creek drainage, the way the grass in the lower fields had a different texture from the upper, which meant water or soil composition, and she filed it away without deciding yet which. The town of Delvin was larger than it had looked arriving by train at night. 2 blocks of storefronts, a bank, a feed store, a doctor's office with new paint, a a dressmaker next to a hardware. People moved on the sidewalks with the particular purposeful quality of people who have things to do, and enough winter coming to be aware of it. He tied the wagon in front of Rennick's General and helped her down without being asked to, and then seemed mildly surprised that he had done it, which she found briefly interesting. Inside, the woman behind the counter was named Lottie, which she learned because a customer called out to her as they came in. Lottie was somewhere between 50 and 60, with the manner of someone who had been watching this county's business for long enough to have an opinion about most of it. She looked at the list without touching it, then looked at her, then at him, then back at her. She told them what the account would stand. He looked at the list. She took the pencil from the counter and crossed off the baking powder, which she could make do without using potash from the wood ash. She crossed off the lamp oil, which she had found an additional tin of in the back of the cold storage. She left everything else. Lottie looked at what remained and said that was manageable. When he was loading the wagon, she stayed a moment inside, and Lottie set both hands flat on the counter and looked at her directly. She asked how long she was planning to stay. She said she didn't know yet. She said the place was in reasonable shape. Lottie said it had not always been. She said it had been in considerably less reasonable shape 3 years ago, and that the improvement was due to him entirely, and that she thought people in town had not given that sufficient credit. She said she would remember that. Lottie said she hoped she would. She carried the smaller parcel out herself. He had the larger one already in the wagon bed. She set hers beside his and climbed up, and he handed her the reins while he untied the hitch post, and then he climbed up and she handed them back without comment. On the ride home, he told her about the freight contract, how he'd gotten it, what it required of him, what it paid. He told her the terms in detail, month by month, which told her he had thought about whether to tell her and had decided she should know the actual numbers. She listened and asked one question about the weight requirement per delivery, and he answered it, and then said she was the first person he'd told the details to since he'd signed the contract. She looked at the road. She said she thought the contract was a good one. He said he thought so too. Winter came in November with more intention than anyone had hoped. Snow first, then cold that settled and stayed, the temperature dropping at night to places that made the barn the most important building on the property. She took the chickens water twice a day because it froze every few hours, and they needed water more than people remembered. She adjusted the feed mix with the oyster shell and wood ash she had made, and within 3 weeks the 2 thin birds had come back to themselves, and all 14 were laying reliably through the cold, which in her experience was unusual, and she was privately pleased with it. He noticed the eggs. He didn't say much about it, but one evening in December he came in and set a small paper-wrapped package on the kitchen table and went to wash up at the basin. She opened it while he had his back turned. It was a bar of lavender soap, the kind sold at Rennick's, better quality than what she had been making do with. She set it on the windowsill above the wash basin where he would see it when he turned around. When he turned around, he looked at the windowsill for a moment and then looked away and said supper smelled good. She said it was beef stew and that there was enough for tomorrow, too. He sat down. She brought the pot to the table. Outside, the snow came down in the particular quiet way of heavy snow, muffling everything so that the sounds of the house expanded to fill the space. He said, halfway through his bowl, "I've been thinking about putting in a second chicken run, separate from the main coop, for the young stock if we expand in spring." She looked at him. She said she thought that was a good idea. She said the southeast corner of the yard would be the best location because it got morning sun and was protected from the northwest wind by the barn wall. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said she had been here 2 months. She said she knew. He said she knew this place better than he had after the first 2 years. She didn't answer right away. She refilled his bowl and then sat back down. She said she had learned to pay attention early, that it had been necessary where she grew up, and she had simply never stopped. He looked at his bowl. He said, "Is that a thing that costs you something, paying attention that way?" It was the most personal question he had asked her in 2 months. She thought about it honestly. She said some days it was heavy. She said mostly she didn't notice it anymore, the same way you stop noticing the weight of your own coat. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the snow kept coming. The fire breathed in the stove. He said, I notice things too. I just don't always say them. She said she had gathered that. He said, I've noticed you since you came. She held very still. He said it plainly, the way he said things that mattered to him, without trying to make them sound smaller or safer than they were. He said he had not been looking for more than the practical arrangement he had described in the letter. He said something had changed in the way he understood what he had asked for, and in the way he understood what she had brought with her, and he thought he ought to say so, because he was not willing to leave her uncertain about where he stood if she had been thinking about it at all. She had been thinking about it, she told him that. He was quiet. The snow moved at the window. The clock on the shelf said 8:15 the way it always did, steady and unchanged. He got up from the table. He came to where she was sitting and stopped, not close enough to reach without choosing to, far enough away that choosing was still required of her. He was a man who understood the difference. She pushed back her chair and stood. She put her hand against the side of his face, flat, the way you put a hand against something you want to know the temperature of. He was warm. He put his own hand over hers, briefly, and then lowered both their hands and held hers between both of his, and she felt the weight of that. His two hands, her one, solid and present and not hurried, candid. Outside, the snow stopped, and the silence afterward was total, and the cold, clear air came in at the cracks of the window frame, and neither of them moved to do anything about it. Spring came the way it always did in Montana, later than you thought it should, and faster once it started. The creek came up, then settled. The upper pasture dried enough to walk by April. She put in the south garden the way she had planned it. Onions first. Then the brassicas along the wall where the stone held heat. Then the longer rows down the center where the soil was deepest and had received the most of what the chickens had contributed over the winter. He built the second chicken run in March, from lumber he had milled himself, from a stand of pine at the far edge of the property. He built it with a south-facing window because she had mentioned the morning sun. She did not remind him that she had mentioned it. He had simply remembered. On a Thursday in May, a woman named Ida from the county land office came out to record some boundary updates on the eastern parcel. She walked the property with him and with her, and at one point stopped at the garden and looked at it for a long moment, and said she had driven past this place for 3 years and had never seen the garden kept. She said it was the second season. Ida said it looked like it had been kept for 20 years. That evening he came in from the barn and stood at the kitchen door, and looked at her at the stove and said, I heard what Ida said about the garden. She said she had heard too. He said, she's not wrong. He said it simply without ceremony, as close to the edge of what he knew how to say out loud as she had ever heard him get. She turned from the stove and looked at him in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands the way he held it when he was standing still somewhere, and didn't quite know what to do with himself. She told him supper was in 10 minutes. He said, all right. He hung his hat on the peg and washed at the basin and sat at the table where the lamp was lit, and the window showed the last of the evening light going off the hills, and she brought the plates and sat across from him, and they ate. The second chicken run was finished by the end of the month. 14 new birds went in on the 1st of June, young and loud and certain of their opinions. She stood at the fence and watched them sort themselves out and felt something she recognized now and no longer tried to name. He came to stand beside her. They watched the chickens. After a while, he said, I've been thinking about adding your name to the account at Rennick's. She looked at him. He kept watching the chickens. He said it was practical, that she went into town sometimes without him and the arrangement would be simpler. He said it without looking at her because he was saying something that meant more than what it said, and he knew she knew that, and that was enough. She said that would be practical. Yes. He nodded. The new birds settled into the run. The old ones in the main coop went about their business. The hills to the west had gone from brown to green, so gradually she had barely noticed, and now they were fully green, and the light on them in the late afternoon was the kind of light that made you stop walking and look. She looked. He looked too. They stood together at the fence, in the easy quiet of people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. And the evening came down the way it always did, patient and without hurry, and the chickens put themselves to bed, and somewhere on the east ridge a bird called once and stopped.